and we can have discussions, talks, whatever, totally cool. And most importantly, I would say my goal with this specific presentation is to just kind of put some stuff in your brains so you talk to your neighbors when it comes up, somebody else in the neighborhood, or a month from now, you know, because a lot of this is going to be stuff that is, you kind of already know, at least 90, maybe 90% of it, you know, yeah, of course, I knew that, but maybe now it's just kind of in a bundle that's easier to regurgitate. That's kind of my idea. So, who was here last time? Most of everybody except you guys, right? So Scott Obla, but I met you before, so this is our first time. So I'll make sure I'm, you know, give you the whole spiel about who I am. But Scott Obla, board certified master arborist with Black Mountain Arborist in Black Mountain, certified ecologist, and some other things in my toolbox. I like to manage forests and trees, and kind of anywhere we work or play or live is kind of what I like to do. Yeah. So the talk today is going to be basically like a wide net of the benefits of trees. And you can use that to, you know, however you want to use it, but this is kind of like a scientific foundation for how trees benefit various parts of our lives, you know. And there's going to be a lot of stuff that are more personal, like I grew up and I was on a tree swing out in my grandpa's yard, and just, you know, that kind of thing. Or, you know, there's scientific data now with technology where, you know, it's kind of like, oh, I didn't know about that. That's a really cool benefit of trees, blah, blah, blah. So just kind of covering that whole spectrum. We'll start with like property values in trees. And I want to talk about how trees can be like assets or also liabilities, and then ROI, return on investment of trees. So like, you know, why do, you know, apart from, you know, whatever you feel is important about trees, what can I expect out of my trees in the future? Is it worth it? You know, why do I plant this tree? You don't plant a tree for 1 year usually, you plant it for the future. And we're just going to kind of aim at like why that is, you know, and how that actually affects our property values, real estate markets, all that kind of stuff. And then we'll go into water, trees, and taxes. So that's like stormwater, erosion, and like saturation of soils. And I'm going to talk about like, you know, basically when it rains at the top of these mountains, the water will get to the lake eventually. And it's kind of like along that journey, where there are trees and where there are not trees is a big difference. And what are those differences? How does that play into water quality down here? What does that cost us when it gets, you know, to a stormwater treatment plant? And the sediment has to be removed because there was a landslide. And, you know, I mean, those bills are insane. And our taxes go up in Buncombe County at least all the time for the French Broad, you know, stormwater management. And, hey guys.
Hello.
How you doing?
Good. How are you all?
Great to see you again.
You too. Yep. This is
Hey, John.
no. Okay. I can kind of slow down way too.
No.
But this is just still the outline, so you'll get it when you see it. And then health and social implications. There's a lot of data now pointing to both physical and mental health benefits of being around trees, having trees in a recovery area, like outside of hospitals. You know, and I urge you to go on Google or wherever and do your own searches for that kind of thing to see like different hospitals are doing different research for their own, you know, hey, we need to install a landscape out here, or we have a courtyard, and instead of, you know, taking out this forest, we're going to put a walk, like just a trail through the forest, instead of having like picnic tables where, you know, for the cafeteria. And those are bigger decisions by, you know, Johns Hopkins and you know, Cleveland or the Mayo Clinic. All these places are making huge investments into this stuff, and it's, you know, kind of on the forefront right now, but it's something that tree people are noticing and trying to promote, you know, on a pretty regular basis. And then also urban forest development. So, you know, you all live here, it's pretty obvious here, but this is kind of a different place, you know, like if you go to Phoenix or Bend, Oregon, also really nice places. People go there and live, they love it, but they're now noticing like where there aren't trees, there aren't these other things, and they want to put more trees in. So, noticing the value in how many trees and how diverse of a tree area that exists here, I think is super cool. Like for you all to be able to live here is like awesome. But at the same time, it's easy to get jaded in a place like this where you're not going into West Asheville and, seeing like 4 lots for every one being put up. Like that's kind of on the other side of the spectrum when I'm talking about like urban forest development. It's kind of like we're missing all the trees and we need to put one. Not like, okay, there's 400,000 and we need to manage them differently. So as I talk about certain things here, you're going to have to remember that it's not just the cool, full of tree neighborhood that you guys live in, but also these other areas like downtown Asheville and West Asheville, closer to us at least, that are really being impacted, because they'll have 1 tree per acre, where the density of trees here is, you could have 400 per acre, and it would be a nice healthy forest that wouldn't be overdense or anything. So those are just some numbers to think about. And then ecosystem functioning, that's probably the most interesting, fun category, just like wildlife, biodiversity, carbon sequestration, how trees kind of help our environment, and all the stuff we like about nature, really, is kind of included in that. And then I included like temperatures and costs in that one, just based on how varying the temperature on the ground and in where we operate on a daily basis can change with or without trees, and without mature trees versus small trees, everything in between. So any questions on the outline? And I'll just wait for this one more person. Yeah, because this is just the first slide, so you're good.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I just, I was going to give you 3 or 4 seconds just to say, like, here's the outline, pretty basic. Such a small group, feel free to talk out loud. I'm Scott. Now we're all good. Okay. So I'm going to include some really famous diagrams that are easy to access online. If I put them in here because I think there's people that are much better at marketing than me, and if you were here last time, I know my Sharpie drawings were like really good, but also like there's other stuff out there that's better to pass around and will give you some more credibility than tree guy came, look what he did. So benefits of urban trees as a summary, filtering like we talked about, cooling, reducing rates, and that's like heart rates and cardiovascular disease, and then also like asthma rates from air quality, protecting biodiversity, that's like the ecosystem functioning, reducing obesity levels by increasing physical activity, and that's part of the urban development program. Like people try to get nature trails and walkways and greenways, and they try to put trees everywhere. Managing stormwater is probably the most important one for here specifically because of the value of the lake, in my personal opinion, and then obviously increasing neighborhood property values. We'll get into that a lot more, but there's a big discrepancy now between new house builds that are starting with a slate and fresh trees versus existing homes with mature trees. It's a 15 to 20% difference in same house, same everything, except for mature trees versus not. And mature landscape too is included in that. And then also reducing stress, which is, this is another thing you've probably been seeing a lot more lately, forest bathing, meditation in forests, all that kind of stuff. But there's data now to support it. And it's not just a yoga in the woods type thing, it's more of like, I'll walk out and there's another piece of data that came out recently about looking at water. It's the same thing. If you go out to the ocean and you look at the water, it has a physiological effect on your body, reduces your heart rate, kind of calms you down, sends some cortisol levels back to normal, that kind of thing. And I'm not a doctor, but I use the data. So
You can't put back the
yeah, a pond though, for sure. So property value. So assets versus liabilities and ROI. So, you know, assets, and I'm just going to define what I think of as assets because, you know, I do a lot of finance work in my spare time. So, like, when I think of an asset, it's like something that is adding value or adding money. It's not a valuable. You know, it's not something that you can depreciate on taxes. It's more of something that's putting extra money back in your pocket or back on your, you know, balance sheet. It's something that is increasing in value, right? But also like, hey, my money is, I'm getting more money or whatever that is. It's something that is working for you. You're an asset. That's how I look at it. Liability, opposite of that, right? Something that depreciates, something that takes your money every year. Something, you know, it's the exact, just opposite idea. And then ROI, just return on investment. That's pretty simple to understand at this, you know, I think, you know, put this much in. How's that going to grow throughout the years? Whatever I'm looking at, you know, whether it's a percentage or, you know, the market's been kind of sideways lately, but we'll see. So mature trees, average value, anywhere between $1,000 and $10,000 each, and that value is based on like a replacement cost value. So, you know, it could be more valuable to someone or less valuable to someone, but in the court system, if somebody vandalizes your tree or somebody comes and cuts it down or something, there is a systematic approach to putting a number on that tree. And they range between like 1,000 and 10,000. I've valued trees all the way up to $95,000 for a single tree once in my life. And I've also had similar sized trees valued at like $300. So there's all the different coefficients that go into targeting that value. And we won't get into the math of that, but that's just kind of a good range to think about when you're looking at property value. You know, you can just kind of add them up. Street trees in Portland, as for one example, they did a study, increased each home value by over $7,000, separate from the value of the home. So, you know, they went through and planted street trees as a city, and the values of those homes that were adjacent to the street trees all increased on an average of like $7,000, $8,000 immediately. Just, you know, yep.
Okay, so you're talking about these trees having a value of $1,000 to $10,000, or in the state of North Carolina, the maximum fine you can find someone for cutting a tree down, like in a development like ours, is $100 per tree.
Yep. So that's a fee schedule.
Why is that? It's that much of a discrepancy in the value.
Because that's kind of like a slap on the wrist with a ticket from a police officer. The way that I would look at this, and this is just super freestyling here, you're driving a car that your dad gave you from the whenever, 60s, whatever it is. Value that the North Carolina Department of Transportation would put on that car versus the value that it meant to you as a person, right? Or as a collector, or as something like this. These are values as far as like a real estate adjuster goes in and he's giving you an appraisal for your house. These are the numbers he's going to use, and that's not, oh, if somebody cut it down, they're going to have to pay this much amount. It's, you know, this house has 3 mature trees in the front. This house, you know, in a comparable home, and you're doing house shopping, doesn't have any, or has 1. That's the math that they're going to use. Okay, you know, these are each 5,000, 5,000, 5,000. This house is going to be appraised at 15,000 more than this house that's a comp without these trees. So it's more of a value and less of a fee or fine, if that makes sense.
Yeah. That fine's all politics, that's all.
It's all politics, and that's from the development, the development rules and regulations from a long time ago. And, you know, there's a lot to say about that stuff, but the point of these numbers is more of, you know, that classic car where, you know, DOT would say it's worth $300. Like my F-350 flatbed, it's probably worth, you know, I could sell it for $25,000, $30,000, but NCDOT says it's worth like $2,200. You know, that kind of difference. And it's like, okay, well, you know, it's what people will buy for the value or what is part of some schematic. Yeah. Okay.
Scott, is it dependent on the species of trees?
Species, size, health, wholesale cost, basically. Mm-hmm. So the quick dirty of it is there's a trunk formula. So you say you have a 40-inch white oak, okay? Mm-hmm. Okay, so, you look at the location. Is it the only tree in the yard? That gets a higher score. Is it an oak? Will get a higher score than a black locust. Is perfect health, higher score than something with low health. And then you take the cross-sectional area of that, and you look for how much does an oak cost from B.B. Barnes or a nursery wholesale. And let's say it's $125 for 1 inch. So you have 1 square inch at $125. And then when you look at a 40-inch diameter, all of a sudden that starts to add up quite a lot. And that's how they get that Trump formula. So it's just all basic math, and that's what keeps it kind of in line with appraisal values, and it's just a formula. Okay, I did it, here it is, There was a fire that broke out in Asheville, and the fire jumped across and burned a mature landscape of an apartment complex we take care of. It affected 2 pin oaks very poorly, very badly, and we had to do a replacement cost analysis on them. Each of them got about $8,500. Now, nobody paid that $8,500 because they didn't die, but they put a value on those trees to where, when they came back for the insurance way later, the insurance of the apartment actually gave them $8,500 to bring those trees back to health through a 5-year program. It's like that kind of thing, So, any other questions about that stuff? I know we got off a rabbit. Large trees in yards can increase home values up to 15%. That's going to be redundant now. Landscaping with trees can increase by homes by 20%. I mean, we're talking just like a house with all grass versus a house with mulch beds and multi-layers of understory, mid-story, canopy trees. And that's kind of the difference on the spectrum that I see. So, going into this a little bit closer, bigger and healthier usually equals higher value when we're talking about tree value, okay? And that doesn't mean, oh, this tree got too tall and it's scary and I need to take it down bigger. This means just more mature, established, healthy, good structure, nice big trees that you see on college campuses, stuff like that. Oh, wow, majestic, trees. Like if you've ever seen the angel oak down in the southeast, like that kind of thing. So maintaining the health and structure of mature trees increases value over time. So as that tree grows and stays healthy, it's going to put on more value every year because it's growing and the size is getting bigger and it's appraised at a higher, value. You don't take care of that tree, we'll get into that in a minute, but then it could be the opposite effect, right? Less grass, less gas. That's kind of the thing we're promoting lately. Large tree-centric mulch beds are easy to maintain and cost less than mowing lawns for long-term outlooks, especially on slopes like this, in areas that are new, where they flip the clay upside down and kind of sculpt a yard for a new home, and people try to grow grass year after year. They end up putting no-mow out there. It always looks clumpy. There's always dirt patches. It's never that crispy, Midwestern lawn type situation, as far as I understand. And if it is that, it takes a lot of work and a lot of money to maintain, the golf course effect. So, that's kind of something that we look at now. And, you put a big mulch bed in around this giant tree as much as you want. You might have to pull some weeds every year, but you're not going to be weed eating and mowing all the time. And it's going to look really nice if you do it in the right way, and it's going to promote the health of that tree at the same time. Rule of scarcity. If you're not familiar with that, properties of forest areas and diverse, well-maintained landscapes are becoming fewer and further in between, and that's like a reference to in Asheville where it's a 4-for-1 now. They're taking lots and splitting them. So when they do that, instead of one house with 1 acre and 10% mature trees, it's 4 houses with 1/4 acres and no trees except all the trees are brand new. Small. So, and that might be perfectly fine for some people. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but the value of that is different than, the big, expansive, nice, mature tree that provides all the benefits that we're about to talk about. Yep?
Just, you mentioned the mulch around the tree. Kind of a tangent. What do you think of things like river rock? Is that, healthy for trees if it's not, or do they need a big, river rock it's not completely impervious.
Yeah.
But
I would say that's site and species specific. So there are a lot of trees that prefer a more xeric landscape, dry, ridgy, like Carolina hemlocks. There's a lot of species around here that prefer a rocky area. And if you don't have an area that's collecting too much water and causing, a saturated soil or too much runoff, perfectly fine as a ground cover, you know.
Do they usually need to be a ways away from the base of the tree?
Yeah, any ground cover, just as a landscaping tidbit, any ground cover, mulch, rocks, whatever you have, should be, you know, a decent amount away from the trunk, and preferably kind of at the end of where a trunk tapers into the ground naturally. Most trees around here are okay. When you get into the newer neighborhoods, they end up kind of like raising them, and you have like the mulch volcano effect, and you have kind of this earth around the tree. If the tree looks like a telephone pole coming out of the ground, it's probably buried too deep. We unbury trees at least once a week. Like, that's part of our service that we provide. You know, we have a big air gun, we blow all the air out. You know, we kind of like, I can show you some pictures after the talk, but it's, you know, we kind of excavate the soil away from that until we start to see that flare, because in that flare, the buttress roots, like from last talk, that's like the brain of the tree, and it has to have gas exchange, and it has to talk to the rest of the tree and the apical meristems and say, hey, I'm underwater, I can't get enough oxygen, I'm getting too much, blah, 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 blah. So everything you do around the base of a tree should be just outside that trunk flare, you know? Whether it's rock mulch, whatever you decide to put. Even, I mean, there's ground cover that's perfectly fine, you know? And if you walk into a forest that's undisturbed, and I mean undisturbed like people aren't blowing leaves into the trees, you'll notice that most of the forest trees exist with that taper. Even if they're in full leaf litter right now, you'll see that taper, you know? So just something to look out for.
Thank you.
Yep. So trees as liabilities, you know, I'm not going to pretend like that all trees are awesome and we should hug them all and they're all good, because they do cause problems. But poor management usually results in higher costs. So removing trees or poor maintenance of existing trees and tree health can lead to high costs and loss of property value. So in the same breath that mature trees increase value, losing those mature trees from poor maintenance will decrease their property value. You know, just very simple terms. So when a tree becomes a liability is usually when, you know, it's neglected or damaged or something. So dangerous and hazardous trees, through poor pruning practices, mechanical damage, those are the main causes for tree failure. Roots are trenched and then covered up, and it's usually an unseen situation that leads to a full tree failure. And then, you know, even smaller trees in our yards sometimes become damaged from weed whackers and mowers and things like that, which leads to failure. So that's when a tree is kind of a liability versus an asset. Also non-native invasives, so unchecked growth of monoculture species. So if you have a lot of one kind of tree that's growing up and, you know, it's all you have, outbreak for diseases and pathogens can wipe out all of them all at once. And usually it's the non-native invasives that are creating those monocultures that end up looking like aspen groves out west, but here it's unnatural. We don't have trees like that operate, you know, in that same growth pattern. So trees create high ROI, so, you know, initial costs are low. If you're planting small trees, pruning them while they're young and getting on a pruning regimen, like while they're this tall, might seem silly, but by the time that tree gets bigger and more mature, it's not going to need huge activity to get it back to a functioning mature tree, right? It's going to just grow into its nice scaffold branches, spaced well. It's not going to be buried too deep. It's much easier to take care of a small tree for the future than it is to try to go backwards and correct a mature tree's problems. That's kind of the point of that. And then also like management plans, creating a management plan and working with arborists can help develop long-term efficiency. So like just getting a plan on paper, I'm going to prune this tree once every 3 years. And, you know, it seems a little bit, you know, oh, he's going to show up for 10 minutes for every 3 years. But that 10 minutes every 3 years, if not done, will probably turn into like an 8-hour day 15 years from now that was going to cost you way more or be a surprise kind of thing, you know. So trying to manage, it's like, you know, dollar cost averaging when you're young. It's like, oh, it's so boring, but it's the best way to play the stocks, right? So, you know, here's just some numbers from the ISA. Tree property value increases. So you have on the left side, like tree retention during development. So, you know, if 2/3 is wooded, it can increase up to 37%. I mean, you can go through these numbers yourself, but it's basically, you know, kind of what the other numbers point to on a graph. You know, so you have low-income neighborhoods, high-income neighborhoods, 15 to 20%. You can access this later too if you want to make more sense of it. It's kind of hard to like check out right away, but we'll get in. So water, trees, and taxes, stormwater. Quick facts. This is from last time too. One mature tree can process up to 100 gallons or even more if it's bigger out of the ground. So that means, you know, just to be redundant, it's accessing 100 gallons of water every day and taking it out of the ground and transpiring it as water vapor into the, you know, into the earth, whatever, right? So that's not on a rainy day, that's just on an average every single day, each tree. So, you know, the trees also reduce sediment and erosion along bodies of water, they increase slope stability. You know, patches of forest do a really good job of filtering water before they get to lakes and streams, and that's due to like uneven topography. You don't have this like, you know, slope of, you know, like a flat slope leading into the water. It's like, you know, really diverse topography and little, you know, big patches of rocks and soil and divots and things, just to kind of get a visual image of that. Canopies intercept rain, preventing soil disturbances. So literally, like just having something that raindrops hit before it hits the ground, super important because, you know, rain, it's, you know, if it hits the ground right in front of you, okay, not that big of a deal, but if you've ever watched your gutter that got popped off of something and it's going into a thing of clay, it will erode that immediately, one day. That water will just take all that dirt, and just make a runoff like the Grand Canyon immediately. So on a bigger scale, that becomes really important. And we're not talking about, you don't need 100% canopy cover, but having a lot of canopy cover in an area that is, you know, more susceptible to erosion and sediment problems is beneficial, you know. And then keeping something on the ground, leaf litter, debris, whatever, is also like a secondary layer of that interception. Trees reduce water treatment processing costs. We talked about this. So like, you know, how much it costs to take the junk out of the water can be, you know, relieved by having a nice set of trees, you know, on the way there. So stormwater management, groundwater accumulation, cycling water out of the ground helps prevent soil saturation. So if you know, this is kind of redundant also, but without that constant water being pulled out of the groundwater or the water table will fill up with water, and it's a lot slower to percolate or move wherever it is. So then if it rains, instead of percolating into the ground where it can like be absorbed and stored and then used on a slow time release way, immediately you get puddling on the surface, and then you have very fast, high velocity stormwater problems. So if the ground is already saturated and it rains or you have an event, the result is exponentially, you know, faster and more voluminous. It's a tough word for me to hit. You know, so you imagine like this sponge, a dry sponge, pour water into it on the counter. It's not going to make that big of a mess. If you take a wet sponge, it's already soaking in wet, and put it on the counter and pour water into it. Most of the water you pour into it is going to be all over the counter. That's kind of the image that I see when I think about this type of thing. So, you know, keeping that soil healthy and moving water in and out of it is very important. And then excess groundwater on a slope can cause landslips and mudslides in certain conditions. So, you know, I think of it as a slope like this, and let's say you take a bunch of trees out of here, but there's a bunch of trees that exist down here. Now you have this layer, which is my arm, of soil that is very heavy, full of water, on a very steep slope, pushing down into soil that is being, you know, cycled fine. That saturated soil will overtake that dry soil pretty quickly, and that's what leads to landslips and landslides and mudslides. It's kind of a heavy weight of soil moving down into the rest of the soil, if you can imagine like, you know, a 3D image of that. So obviously trees have their part with structural roots as well as moving that water out like lickety-split. Erosion control is pretty basic, but healthy soil building, so leaf litter and debris, also mulch, also river rocks, creates a sponge layer on the ground that, well, rocks don't do a sponge layer, but, you know, they intercept well. Creates a sponge layer on the ground that helps manage water movement and percolation, so I was kind of ahead of myself, but keeping that stuff on the ground. That's why you see a bunch of these signs that are kind of like, leave leaves alone. Yeah, you don't want them in your driveway to slip and fall, but if you push them into your beds and into the forest, if it's a manageable amount of them, too much can lead to too high of a decomp rates, which is no good. But a decent amount of leaves out in your mulch beds, in your forest beds, in your tree beds is very positive. And then rainwater interception is just the other thing we talked about. Tree canopies intercept rain, reduce the impact of soils below, allowing water to disperse easier. So not only is it intercepting, but it's intercepting and slowing that rain down to a point of where if you look at a big tree, like this, as that rain hits that tree, it's not like it bounces right off the leaf and falls to the ground. It's kind of going to drop to the next one and the next one, and it's kind of going to run down that tree like a kind of a branching vascular pattern type thing. So it's really important. I'll go back to that image in a second. But so the filtering part of it absorbs toxins. Trees are very good at kind of taking things in, trapping them in the wood. Removing all sorts of nasty stuff by the time before it gets into the streams and lakes where it could leach and become much more of a problem. And as long as that wood is kind of decomposing later on in life at a slow rate, it's usually not nearly as harmful, and those toxins are, their half-lives are long enough to where it's been depleted or taken down quite a bit in the concentration. Sediment reduction. So sediment is kind of a curious word. Does anybody, what's someone's definition of sediment? And
Collection of sand, loose gravel.
yeah, so sediment technically is anything that moves with water. It could be, my keys or sand mostly, or clay particles, or, so when we talk about sediment and erosion, the idea behind that is a movement of soil particles from one place to another. And there's all sorts of different reasons for that. Sand is a big particle. When it moves, it clogs stuff, it gets in the way, it creates turbidity in the rivers. Clay is much smaller, but clay also promotes like a hydrophobic layer. So clay, kind of just like a clay bowl, when you have clay eroding and moving with water as sediment, wherever it is dispersed, so if it's dispersed on top of the forest ground, now the next time water tries to percolate down, it's going to hit that clay and just run right off, because clay does not allow water to percolate very well, which makes it great for pots and a subsoil layer, but when we do digging and things like that, it oftentimes gets flipped to the top and creates kind of this sponge layer underneath, and then you have decomposition and decay happening underneath, no water or gas exchanges happening, and it's kind of rot. It just turns into a rotten mess. I like this diagram just because it kind of shows heavy rain. The tree is intercepting. If you can't see it well, this says leaf litter, nutrients, better soil structure on the ground. You have runoff, happening. You have the tree root system here. Recharging the water table just means like filling the water table up and letting it go, to its underground systems naturally at a natural rate. It's pretty basic, but you can see like way over here, unintercepted rain. If there is no sponge or cycling, it hits and runs like on pavement or concrete or any impervious ground, which is why porous driveways are becoming popular now. They're creating asphalt material that allows water to go down and get back into the earth or wherever, instead of hitting and running and wherever it ends up being, can clog or with high velocity runoff can cause all sorts of problems for everybody. So not just tree related. Health and social implications. So trees stimulate economic development, and that is, we'll get into that a little bit more, but basically people want to have shops and developments where there are trees because they like it's the same feeling as kind of being in a park. It's inviting, it's framing, it doesn't look stark. There's all these different ideas, but it kind of means the same thing. Visual exposure to settings with trees has been correlated with significant recovery from stress, within 5 minutes, as indicated by changes in blood pressure or muscle tension. I got this straight from the study, so like, and I'll repeat that in a second, the same thing. But basically, like, you know, just kind of looking at trees can reduce all sorts of good stuff for your body. And then post-surgery recovery time, 80% faster in hospitals with trees in recovery areas. That's like the biggest finding that's happened in the tree world that is like tangible lately. It's like they actually did this at many different hospitals, and they came out with, oh my gosh, like when people can go and sit in a park under a tree, take a walk while they're recovering from surgery, they recover 80% faster and more, you know, without complications versus not. So that's something that I was talking about earlier. Like these big clinics are really focusing, putting a lot of money towards creating like these, what they're calling hospital parks. You know, very cool stuff. So this is just a repeat of that, but so, you know, looking at trees, something, if you've never done it and it seems a little foo-foo, I agree, but forest bathing is actually pretty cool. You know, it's kind of a Japanese technique, or there's other beginnings of it, but essentially it's just kind of like walking through the forest, and you know, the whole point of it for me, when I lead these things sometimes, I try to get people to, you know, less of a, you know, out there thing, and just follow a tree's trunk and try to go from, like, while you're walking, most people look down, like it's just a habit, you know, you don't want to trip. It's just most human beings do not ever look up, and when they look up, it's so quick and unfamiliar that it's not really an absorbing type feeling when you look up. So if I'm leading like a forest bathing trip, I'm like, okay, you know, we're not going to get into a bunch of like spiritual stuff or anything like that, but I want you to take your eyeballs and just go from the ground and follow a tree trunk, look at every part of the tree, all the way up until you get to the first branch or second branch, and then follow that branch over until you get into another tree, and then follow that branch to that trunk and back down. And do that like, you know, like this. And pretty soon, like after 15 minutes, I look around and there's like 5 people just kind of going like, you know? And it's like this new way that they're looking at stuff, you know, because usually it's like, oh, you know, and then they're back down. But like, so to take like the foo-foo side out of it and just do a visual experiment for yourself, try that. Just walk through the woods, try to follow one tree up, get on a branch and go to another tree and go back down, and just follow the trees for a couple minutes and see what you see that's like abnormal to your everyday visual exposure. Because you'll start to see like how I see the trees in the forest is very three-dimensional up top. And it's because I spend time up there, I know what it looks like going down too, but also like, you know, I see the differences like on a, you know, like a three-dimensional kind of aspect to trees. And I think that's important for people to kind of experience. And then the physical health thing, we just talked about this, but what?
That's how she looks at people sometimes.
Yeah. We're basically going to go out and kill some trees.
That's fair, that's fair.
About trees.
I love to look at trees, really, seriously.
So that's fair. But, you know, anyway, so yeah, instead of just a quick up and down, do that thing once, get back to me and tell me it's BS or hey, it worked. I love feedback.
So with the health implications of
Yep.
being around trees and recovering, do you think the states will do a better job of trying to protect trees?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Is there any legislation that you're aware of in North Carolina that maybe they'll start, I don't know, fining, I guess you would say, sharper fines, higher fines for just random tree cuttings, or?
So to jump out of a political hoop
Yeah, I not,
and
yeah,
sit over here as a
yeah,
regular person,
yeah,
you know, I sat on the board of directors for the North Carolina Urban Forest Council. They have their own lobbyist, and what ends up becoming the main issue is private land, I'm going to do what I want, versus public land, we can tell you what you can do, right?
yeah.
So the only connection there is usually what something's done outside of your private land that affects your private land, right? So one of the few things that connects your land to someone else's land is stormwater runoff, which is why I included in here a lot. My neighbor, they cut down a bunch of trees. They didn't do anything to manage the new increase in stormwater damage. Now, this is happening. I'm getting clay in my, whatever it is. There's
Yeah.
a million different variables that go into play. Or I got sun, I'm feeling great. It could be positive too,
Yeah.
right? So, the biggest hurdle is trying to find those connections. And as somebody who sat on that board for 3 years and wrote grants and approached lobbyists and waited for agendas to be pushed and passed, and I will tell you from personal experience, it's going to be more about educating. It's going to rely on talks like this, 10 people here passing whatever information that they feel is viable or useful, maybe 10 more people, maybe 5 more people, whatever it is, it's going to end up relying on the education, and you're going to have to do, what I see is if you educate, people will still make their own decisions about things, right? No matter what. Well, I found personally that with education versus being uneducated, those decisions are a lot easier to make, So it becomes less about, like maybe property value is something that somebody in here will really care about, Maybe not. Maybe squirrels are something that someone in here will really care about. Either way, it's the same talk, right?
Yeah.
It's the same tree. So like, that's what I see as being the most important legislation is going to be increasing the educational component, whether it's in public schools or available to the public, residents of North Carolina, whatever it is, but the legislation that I see is not going to be rules and regulations, it's going to be tax incentives. And that tax incentives really, I hate to say it, but that's what really gets people by the horns.
Yeah.
That's a hard question to answer quickly.
Oh, yeah.
But that's where I see it. There's never probably in my lifetime, whatever. I've never been able to, even in a self debate, I've never been able to work one side over the other. Right? I own land. I'm a landowner. I don't want somebody to tell me what to do.
Sure.
And that might be based on like scientific data that they're providing for some other reason. But at the same time, I'm educated, so I'm gonna, look at it a little differently. I've never been able to win my own debate, and until I can, I probably won't have a good answer for like what would work in legislation.
Sure.
So for me, it's just learning. I like to learn. I like to educate. I like to talk to people and find out what they know and what they don't. And that's kind of where I landed on that idea. Yeah. Yep.
Locally here, I may be wrong on this, but it seems like the county, any county-owned property allows clear cutting that we've seen. But the town does not. Is that a correct statement?
That's correct.
And so somehow the town of Lake Lure hasn't managed to influence the people even on private property to not clear cut. Because, you can go down Route 9 right now and you can tell where the county line is.
Yep.
Because somebody has completely, so there's gotta be some way to help influence these people. I don't know how the town has done it, I haven't dug into it enough, but they seem to have been able to do more than others.
That's a great point. And the
You can
biggest,
find county lines by the destruction when you go by.
and that's a great point. My 2 cents on that would be the roots, pun intended, of that issue are stuck in the timber industry. So, there's a lot of history in timber here. It's a cradle of forestry right down the road in Brevard, any of these places out here, most of the forests here are secondary succession. They have been logged twice already. There's very few unadulterated forests anywhere within, Joyce Kilmer is kind of the closest, but even Joyce Kilmer, if you remember from last talk, and if you weren't here, Joyce Kilmer, has anybody been to Joyce Kilmer? So it's a place over by Robbinsville. They have poplar trees that are 7, 8, 9 feet diameter, massive trees that will scale anything here by far. But as somebody who's studied forests, even those are new compared to if you look on the ground, there's mature chestnut trees that are 11, 12 feet diameter on the ground from the blight in the 50s, right? So, average canopy height back then was between 100 and 150 feet. It's very cool for me to encounter a 100-foot tree here, and I love doing it. I love climbing them. It's great, but they're usually smaller, and they're usually pioneer species like poplars that are growing tall quickly, and that's how they get there. It's been a long time since we've had mature, like a collection of 100-foot oak trees, because that would indicate kind of a more advanced forest, like as far as like succession goes, as far as like going from prairie land to mature diverse forest. We're kind of in the middle in most of the forests around here that are dominated by poplars, hemlocks. Oak and hickory is there, but they're on a smaller scale than they once were. We took fire out of the picture, so everything's kind of not going very well for the forests to evolve back into a climax forest, which is what a forester or forest ecologist would talk about as kind of like the most productive forest. The most net primary production is what they measure there. How much carbon sequestration is happening? How much biodiversity do we have? This is where we get all of our medicines. This is where we get Advil and penicillin. All that stuff happens in the climax forest where you have crazy amounts of diversity and enough room for things to kind of naturally become explored and investigated. So that's kind of a quick, yep.
Going back to your comments about education,
Yeah.
not to put you on the spot,
I
but
mean,
do you?
clearly I love attention.
Do you speak at schools?
I do,
Friends
yeah,
school?
I do. I do a lot of Montessori school stuff. It's hard to get into the public school arena. You have to.
How about charter schools?
I would do charter schools. I haven't had much experience. I've done some stuff with ArtSpace in Swannanoa. But yeah, no, I'm open to anything. I usually get the most feedback and leniency with Montessori. Young, first through fifth grade Montessori kids. And, I do a lot of like, hey, let's go on a nature walk. And we do tree identification and, stuff like that. Public schools are great. It's just a lot harder to jump through the whole, like loopholes and timing and, everything. It's just kind of harder to achieve right now for me, But no, I love speaking at schools, for sure.
One follow-up, because
Yeah.
you mentioned fires on there, but
Yeah.
we just went through a fire, well, I don't know if we're through it yet, we're in a fire season,
Yeah.
and we just had some recent ones. If you were the fire chief, where do you stand on how much they should stop these, control them, or let them burn? I mean, is this a big question?
Caveat, my master's is in fire ecology,
Okay,
and I studied all the prescribed and wildland fires for the past 15 years in the Smoky Mountain National Park. So it is a big question, but it's site specific. To get it to a small answer, I would say it's site specific and danger specific. If it's just burning through a forest, I'm pro burn. I'm pro prescribed burn though, because what we found in my study, in fact, I created the asymptotic value for ground truth and Landsat imagery to ecological effects. So like basically you can look at Landsat imagery, use my formula, and figure out like what's going to grow and how much damage was done to the forest. So when I looked at all that data, I found that low to moderate severity fires were the key to regenerating fire-adapted species, like white oak and chestnut oak, for instance. They're both white oaks, but they are on a fire regime of like 2 to 14 years. They have to have fire every 2 to 14 years to maintain a dominant position in the forest canopy. If they don't, they lose out. They
usually
usually
get squeezed out by the invasive or other species.
mainly music species like maples, poplars, that basically fire, takes the litter layer down to a certain level, right? So oaks have a really competitive advantage when the litter layer is mainly oak leaves, because it's high in tannins. They cover their competitors the next season. If you notice, oak leaves stay on longer than
Yeah.
most other trees, right? So that's kind of an evolutionary trait. And they drop them later, usually to cover up other species that would grow up in the spring and outcompete them. In a forest that has, in a, got it. In a forest that has like, no fire, right? Other species will slowly start to come up, and the first thing that maples and poplars do is they grow straight to the sky. And they grow as fast as they can, and they drop as much leaf litter as they can. That leaf litter becomes part of the soil and becomes a burnable leaf litter at a higher rate than the oak leaves. Oak leaves are, they're harder to burn. They're thicker, they have tannins. It's not a type thing. Maples and poplars and even black locust leaves will burn immediately. So what ends up happening is that litter layer provides enough sponge to hold enough water to now allow maples and poplars a competitive advantage. Now oaks don't have a competitive advantage anymore. Their acorns are buried way too deep. The sun's not hitting them. Now poplars and maples are growing up. They're putting shade over immediately. They can grow in the shade and then take off afterwards also. It's called mesification, or mapleization. There's two different terms they use for it, but it's when you have this dry fire regime forest type that's slowly becoming a wetter forest type because of the lack of fire. But
I don't think I would like to be your neighbor if you didn't like me. I think there's some way we can figure out. But that's interesting, because even in the Canadian fires, I listened to a big podcast, and there's two sides of, do you stop this stuff or do you just let it go?
Yeah.
And they went pretty deep into it's pretty interesting stuff, actually.
So a very quick idea about that here, right? I know these forests like the back of my hand. If it's on the southwest slope, right, I would let it go. If it's on a northeast slope, I would stop it. And that is the natural fire regime ecotype locations here. So if you look at a southwest slope, dry, sandy, shortleaf pine, it smells piney. It smells dry. There's sand on the ground. Northeast side of the mountain, rhododendron, poplars, hemlocks, birches, maples, that kind of thing. It's supposed to be wet and shady and cold, and if you think about the sun, that's what happens. In the morning, it comes up on the east, and in the afternoon, when it's the hottest, it's hitting those southwestern slopes, and that has created the environment that is conducive to fire regime species or fire adapted species. So, that's how I look at it. Where fire should be is where it should be let go. Where it's not is where it should be put out. But so, little fire ecology snippet in there.
Yeah.
But yeah, thanks. That's it. I could talk about that for a long time. Any other questions like that, please, I love them. 'Cause I spent a long time. That's how my wife and I talked her into doing data with me in the park. It's terrible.
It was terrible.
It was terrible.
And then there was little acorns in there.
After 3 years, she was like, shoot, I got too much time invested into this. So I better just see it through, the Park Service gave us like walkie-talkies and machetes. And they were like, go for it.
Well, I was gonna ask, I hate to ask you now, but I was gonna ask if there are any climax forests around here.
So there are what I would consider a climax forest, right? So it might not be like the ubiquitous, big, sprawling slopes that we have everywhere that are like, a huge 100-acre woods, right? But if you want to find climax forests around here, the best thing to do is to go like Eagle Rock, up on the opposite side of Chimney Rock, right? Anywhere up on the dry, rocky ridges, the protocol I would give advice to would be find somewhere that was just so bad and hard to log that it never was logged, but those environmental conditions are going to lead to a different type of climax forest. Usually it's Carolina hemlock is the key species. So if you can find a stand of Carolina hemlock, not Canadian hemlock, Carolina hemlock, which if you look to identify the difference, if you look down the twig of a hemlock and, you know, if you can flatten the needles with your fingers like this, it's an eastern, eastern hemlock, which is Canadian hemlock. If the needles go all the way around sporadically, more like a spruce, but not exactly, then it's a Carolina hemlock. And if you find a stand of Carolina hemlocks, you have found a good climax forest. You know, there's a good one up at the top of like Split Rock off the Parkway. The balsam fir forests have some areas on both sides of the Parkway. So if you go up far enough, like past Mount Mitchell, and you get into the balsam fir area up there, and then also down by Silva, same thing. Both of those are really nice, and you'll find patches of Carolina hemlock, and you know, you'll just kind of tell, like, oh yeah, this is old. You know, there's no way they logged this. Like, it's too rocky, it's hard to get to. Yep.
Moving away from this area and you go, say, down to the coast and you're in all the live oaks down there, would that be considered one of those types?
So, depends on where. If it was just one tree that was protected, like on a manor.
Isn't that what the angel oak is in the live oak?
It is, 100%, and you're right. And that is more of a champion individual. And if you want to look at a collection of that stuff, then is anybody familiar with like Skidaway Island in Savannah? So if you're Charleston has some also, like, so between Charleston and Savannah, there are sections of islands that you can go see that do have more of what, I would call a climax coastal woods, you know, coastal kind of climax. And there are live oaks there for sure. The live oaks that we like as champions, you know, the ones that go down and hit the ground and come back up, usually oaks in a forest, like a live oak was in a forest at some point, it usually wouldn't have existed by itself to be able to grow and you know, around here they call them field trees. So around here you'll find like you'll find like an oak that just looks like, oh, King Charles made that oak. Like, oh my gosh, like that's usually because it was kept as a corner point for a property or in the field to provide shade for the farm animals or whatever it was, whatever reason. When a tree is given space to grow, it grows a different kind of form than it does in the forest, right? So a climax forest usually has more of a forest form of a tree in a clump, and it goes, you know, bigger in the middle and tapers down to the sides, you know, kind of thing. But there are collections of those down. If you look up Skidaway Island, if you're in Savannah, it's a really beautiful place to go, and there's like a sanctuary, and you can take a little drive, and that's one of the best places.
In the Congaree area, that's what, Teak?
Yeah. I know where you're talking about.
Okay.
That's separate, but also good. Everglades too, you know, very similar. There's a couple other places in Florida that I'm not familiar with, but inland Florida, there's like, I can't think of it right now, but there's like some inland clear water areas. If somebody can think of them, just shout them out. But inland Florida, there's some really beautiful untouched areas that are kind of like a mixture of swamp, boggy situations. You know, if they weren't ever swamp logged, but that's the kind of place you can find this kind of stuff. And then of course, if you go out west, the bristlecone pine forest in California and Nevada, and it's not impressive. I mean, it's impressive, but it's kind of like, oh, like that's a 5,000-year-old tree. I got a poplar that I keep cutting down the same size as that, and it keeps growing. You know? But there's different, you know, different ideas of what a climax forest would be my main point of that. But yeah, there are some. Around here specifically, tighter into here, Eagle Rock will probably be your closest bet. You go up the top of Weed Patch Trail down there, just hike around up there, and in the rock areas. Also, Rumbling Bald, the bouldering area on Boys Camp Road. If you go up in there and go really far either way, you'll find really cool forest types at the base of the cliffs. You know, they just couldn't get there with logging stuff, you know. So anyway, any other questions about that? I do recommend going to Joyce Kilmer too. That wasn't like a hate on Joyce Kilmer. I like Joyce Kilmer, but you know, at one point after the first woolly adelgid outbreak, they dynamited all the hemlocks, all the dead hemlocks, and it kind of made a really big mess. you know, it's harder to appreciate, but it's still nice to go there. So back to urban forest development, you know, stimulating development, so attracting new business and tourism. You know, people want trees. That's why these, you know, not Biltmore, the fancy place, which is also included there, but like Biltmore Village or, you know, even places that are drawing people in, they plant a bunch of trees all the time, and that's kind of this thing, you know. Commercial retail areas, more attractive to shoppers if they have trees, just like street trees in downtown. Like, people want to be in, around, under, walking through trees. It just gives our, you know, perspective and our, you know, kind of idea of where we should want to go. Just as probably some DNA thing way back when, but, you know, we like it for some reason. Apartments rent more quickly, tenants stay longer. These are all data facts, you know. Space in wooded settings are more valuable to sell or rent. And then the big one is grants and programs for tree-related activities. So, you know, as we are developing, you know, areas that, whether it was subsidized farm area or an area that got given, you know, used to be industrial and now is turning into a park, there are so many grants and programs with lots of money to do tree plantings and nature walks and frisbee golf courses, and, you know, all this stuff is happening, and it's all tree centric. You know, it's all based on, you know, they want to kind of not free forest. They don't want to create like what we have here, but they just, you know, it's more of like a tree, and it's like breaks up the, you know, the farmland or plain, you know, area. So there's a lot of money in it. Is the point of that last one? It's like it pays, you know. But so yeah, Parks and Rec. I mean, every park you go to is they're not trying to keep trees out, right? Like Central Park, for instance. I mean, I used to want to work there when I was younger. You know, I just thought it'd be really cool to be the Central Park arborist. You know.
Until you found what an apartment costs in your central
Times
park.
change. Yeah, that's exactly. And then, so here's just another diagram. It's from One Tree Planted, just a nonprofit that, you know, plants trees. But I like it just because it lists kind of some health benefits and other things. And, you know, I try to play on people who are visual learners also. So if you get a hold of this PowerPoint and you go back through it and you don't like to read all the words, you know, just look at the diagrams. The diagrams say exactly what I did in the words, and you can just save that or whatever. Pull, you know, take a picture of it, pull it out. Oh, I remember that. Boom. That's why I add these like kind of redundant diagrams into my presentation. We'll just move through this so we can talk some more too. But so ecosystem functioning, that's like one of my favorite ones. It's so widespread. I mean, even if you just look over here, like, so what are ecosystem services? It's like air, soil, land, water, strong economy, well-being, food, water, materials, public health, land use, pollution, climate, policy. Ecosystem services are kind of like all of that. And the point about trees would be, trees play probably the most important part in ecosystem services, which are like what having healthy ecosystems can provide for us, or already do provide for us. So, you know, create habitat for plants and animals, that's a gimme. Provides shelter and food for a variety of birds and small animals, same thing. Provides clean air, protection from flooding, carbon storage. Each one of those could be its own tab, but you get the idea. Sequesters carbon from the atmosphere, releases oxygen in the photosynthesis. This helps mammals like us breathe cleaner, easier. Stabilizes soil, controls floods, purifies fresh water, cools the planet in general. Removes pollutants such as CO2, ozone, and particulates from the air, traps them in the wood, and then the wood is stored, and like I said earlier, the half-life, by the time it decomposes or lights on fire, it's a lot less harmful to our, you know, surrounding environment. Any questions on this stuff? So then, you know, the heating and cooling costs, like this is another cool one because we live around. Heating and cooling costs reduced in homes with deciduous trees on the western slides are down like 20 to 50%. So I know I talked about this last time, but the very easy diagram is you have a big, nice oak tree on the west side of your house. In the summer, it's full of leaves and blocks the sun from hitting your attic or your house, or if you're really smart, you have it in front of your utility, actual utility, parts, your utility yard, your AC, whatever it is. So it's shaded, keeps them running efficiently, keeps your house cooler, and then all those leaves fall off in the dead of winter when it's really cold, and allows the sun to hit your attic, hit your side of your house, keeps your heating costs down. So that's like the biggest kind of impactful image of like how trees can sort of help. Also, young trees surrounding a building can cool it as much as 10 AC units running 20 hours a day. That's why they plant trees all around apartment buildings, in downtown areas. They're moving that air up and out, and they're cycling it so much so that it's the same effect as running 20 window units, which is pretty big time for like an apartment building, especially when they're drawing a lot of power. So 1 acre of forest sequesters 6 tons of CO2 and releases 4 tons of O2 annually. That's a lot, especially when you're talking about like a place like this with thousands of acres, not just like 1 acre. I live on 1 acre, so, it's a pretty big situation. Windbreaks reduce costs and keep particulates down, so I don't know about you, but like for me, when the wind hits my house, it's way colder, and you can reduce that with shrubbery and landscaping and, all sorts of different things, but the idea there is that trees kind of slow down wind patterns that exist due to roads and highways and cleared out areas. So, just like in a canyon, wind, travels least resistance. So it can go up your road and blast you through your driveway right into your house. So if you have trees that kind of break that up and block it, whether the wind is hot or cold, it's going to help you manage those temperatures in your house a lot better. And it also keeps smoke down if your neighbors burn wood, stuff like that. That's what I mean like by particulates. And I grew up in Chillicothe, Ohio, where there was mead paper. So like the fumes from mead paper, big time. You wanted to live in a place with a bunch of trees, so you didn't smell like mead paper every day. My dad worked there; he smelled like it. But, another funny tidbit of how life works. Both my wife and I, both of our fathers were Naperville guys, and we were both like just trying to save Treeville. So evapotranspiration, water, coming out of the ground and going out into the atmosphere, keeps ambient temps in urban areas down and can reduce ground temps by 20 to 45 degrees. That's not just in the shade, right? That's like you're out in a parking lot. Everybody has probably had this experience where they've, gone to a big box store in a parking lot with no trees, and dare you even try to go barefoot. I don't know why you would, but oh my gosh, it's probably super hot. Versus if you go, especially the Southeast probably has the best collection of trees in parking lots that I've ever seen in my life. Anywhere down there, Hilton Head, all the places where, that have existed for long enough to know it's important and probably have bare feet visitors. It's a different feeling by 20 to 45 degrees measurably of the ambient temperatures where trees are moving that air, and it's not just like, oh, I'm in the shade, it's cooler. It's just like the whole combination effect of transpiring that hot air, moving it through like a fan, and keeping everything nice and cool. So, just like if it's really humid, for instance, it's much hotter than if it's drier, even if it's the same temperature. I mean, I experienced that. I'm not, if everybody, it's like to be 85 degrees and 85% humidity. Oh my gosh, like forget it. If it's 85 degrees and like 2% humidity, like in Southern California, feels great, and that's kind of the difference that trees make with the humidity. They keep things going. There's no stagnant air. Okay, so here's just some quick diagrams to put some visuals on things. So we have some houses. Direct shading reduces irradiance of buildings. So like when the sun reflects off of buildings, right? That's another thing. Transpiration aggregate cools the air. Same thing we just talked about. You have the windbreak up there. And then, shading paved surfaces, reduce urban heat island effect and ozone formation. So kind of like, even without a bunch of trees, I mean, this is probably 10 to 15% canopy cover. So we're not talking about like trees everywhere that are like the forest. We're talking about very few trees here, and they're doing a huge impact for these buildings, right? There's the paper mill over there. I can't stop. Does anybody listen to Tyler Childers? Country guy? Okay. So listen to Country Squire. It's about the town I grew up in.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's
It's
cool.
pretty, yeah, okay. So has anyone gone through the National Tree Benefit Calculator or have ever heard of it? It's a very cool thing that exists. Arbor Day has a version of it. You can get onto it through iTree. There's different organizations that have adapted it, but I did an example here just so you can kind of go through one with me, and you can do it yourself. It's really fun. You know, it's just something that's interesting, that it gives you a lot of information, and you plug in what you have, so it's kind of like personalized, right? So I chose one of our oak trees in my yard today. It's like a 40-inch oak tree, right? So it asks you what the species is, and I did white oak. What size is it? 40. Is it a single family residential? That's the questions it asks you, and what's your zip code, okay? So I entered that, and then it gives me this number, like benefits of $383 every year. And you know, that's not much when you think about it, but I probably have 75 white oaks on my property, you know, this size, and it's like, okay, now we're talking. Like that's more than that, you know. So you know, it gives you a little tidbit about white oaks, and kind of goes through the numbers of how it came up with this thing. So you go through an overall benefit, and then you have a stormwater benefit. A 40-inch white oak will intercept 7,239 gallons of stormwater runoff this year, right? That's the one tree. This is just the one oak in my yard. I have 75 of them. So try to think of multiply 75 by all these numbers. That's a lot of processing, you know, that's happening there. And this
Are
is
you saying 40 inches tall or
40 inches around, probably, you know, it's a 4
That's
foot.
a big, big tree.
Yeah, we bought the property for it.
You have 75 trees of that size on 1 acre?
Not all white oak, but yeah, mature. Yeah. It's a dense, mature forest.
It sounds like it.
The house is terrible. We were tree hunting, you know, when we were around. And it was
So you bought some trees and got a house with them?
barely a house and a couple of sheds. But yeah, so you know, in 2014, we were lucky because they were about to split the property up, and we found this property, and we're like, you know, they were like, oh, there's nowhere to build on it. You know, it's steep slopes, so you can't take these trees down. And now when you walk onto my property, it's like we've planted some spruce trees around the driveway area. Besides that, it's full forest of 1 acre, which in the city of Black Mountain is like big, like the big area of forest, you know. And you know, now we have hiking trails and dirt bike trails and mountain bike trails all through all of it. And for 1 acre, it seems humongous, but it's because our canopy is at 100 feet. You know, I mean, and I do a good job of to keep it that level. But yeah, we have 75 mature trees.
Wow.
Yeah. Some are red, some are scarlet oaks, some are red maples. So you know, no, they're not all oaks, but they're going to be the similar numbers as this. But yeah, I'm proud of it. We're just now getting to the house stuff, and what a disaster. Crawl
You ever think
space,
about building a
electric.
tree house?
Yeah, I do, all the time. Yeah, I do all the time. My tree house though would be like we'd build floating tree houses, you know. So like it would be like a platform. We've already eyed out where. So it's like between 3 or 4 of the bigger trees, there'd be a floating platform that's connected with non-invasive cabling to either side, you know. It's on the plans, but, you know, we're lucky enough to pay off the property this past year, so it's like, thank God. But now I'm like looking at it, you know, if you've ever had your crawl space encapsulated, that's just a can of worms.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. It's like, oh yeah, looks like you need to upgrade this and you need that and this and that. And then the electrician comes, oh, well, we gotta do it 200 amps. Anyway, all that stuff I wasn't prepared for. But yeah,
But
the
he's got
trees.
his trees.
Yeah, just those trees. Our goal is to find a property where a squirrel could, this is stupid, not to me.
Could go
but-
from tree to tree,
where a
trees
squirrel
going
could
on the ground.
circumnavigate the entire property, you know, at least 50 feet, at least 50 feet in the air, you know. And I'm convinced through, you know, other things the movie Sword and Stone. Are you familiar with that? When they turn into squirrels and they're running around. Somehow that got embedded into my brain when I was young, and now that I'm in my 40s, it's kind of like, I guess that had a lot to do with, where I ended up.
The owner of that property saw you coming.
Saw me coming, yeah, be like, has he seen the wiring, the walls?
This guy likes these trees.
Nope.
He's an arborist, full price.
For sale, only arborists need apply.
Yeah, exactly. Because the whole time we're just like this, the whole time, and he's like trying to point out we did new gravel in the driveway. I'm like, what? I don't care about that. But anyway, so this is the interception rate of stormwater runoff. So the property value by itself, and this doesn't look like a lot, but it will increase every year instead of depreciate. This is where it kind of becomes an asset, right? It's increasing the property value by $58 every year through just growing. And you can read. I'm not going to bore you by reading these paragraphs, but I would highly recommend that for fun. If you're bored later, go on to National Tree Benefit Calculator, pick a tree in your yard, and calculate it out, and you'll be like, oh, I want to do my other tree. I want to do my other tree, and you'll do all your trees and be like, wow, that's really cool. And there's a lot more trees than I thought, so anyway. 40-inch will conserve 446 kilowatt hours of electricity for cooling and reduce consumption of oil or natural gas by 60 therms. I don't know how to relate those numbers, but it's, it's not nothing,
Yeah.
right? It's not negative. So, again, I recommend you just go through this and find your own personal connection to whatever you have, and it's just kind of fun too. And then the air quality, I think, is really cool. So, if you read this, air pollution, serious threat, blah, 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 this gives you a graph of that species and how well it can reduce particulates of certain things in the atmosphere. It's just a really cool, like I said, customizable, quick, took 30 seconds to do this, and you just go through it, and all of a sudden you have some data on your own tree, and you can connect with however you want to connect with it, but I like it a lot. I think it's fun. So atmospheric carbon by 1,584 pounds, and that's a reduction. So it avoids that much and sequesters that much, both useful. And as long as that tree remains healthy and growing and not burned up quickly, it acts as a carbon storage unit, right? So every piece of wood in here, I think it's probably, I don't know, it's probably no wind, but every real piece of wood in here is a carbon storage unit, right? So antiques, wooden antiques, that's you can call yourself a eco freak. Yep, I'm an antique. I collect wooden things and I keep them. Yeah, I'm a carbon storing antiquer. But anything that's wood acts as that. So a live tree, and then when it decomposes, when it dies and falls, that's the other thing too, is most trees don't really have an age limit. It's the environmental stressors that cause them to decline. So somebody asked me the other day, oh, I had a tree guy out and they said the poplar, once the poplars get to be, 100 feet tall, they need to come out. And I'm like, man, once a poplar gets 100 feet tall, it's about to start growing how it should. Yep.
You talked about this subject in our meeting.
Yeah.
And we have tons and tons of fallen trees all through the development. And you said that can be a good thing and a bad thing.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, give me more of a context on.
I think you drove up along Bolt Road.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's
okay.
a lot of trees.
Yeah.
in there.
So
Looks like a tornado went through some spots.
Yeah.
So the obvious, bad thing, negative, if you have too much accumulated down debris, that's a clear fire hazard. For all these other reasons that we're talking about, just like matchbox, accumulated debris. Usually what ends up happening is, for wood to decompose, it needs to have water cycling, right? And where you get the most accumulation is just downslope and upslope of roads. So, you know, a road is going through on a slope like this, and you have a bank on the other side of that road, and a bank on this side of the road, or on the side of a mountain, right? Water in the forest, if you go into deep forest, you'll never find an overaccumulation of debris. You just won't. It takes care of it itself. That's more, it's closer to net productivity, net primary productivity of the climax forest. When you interrupt the water cycling, a road either takes too much water away and doesn't provide enough water to that immediate bank below it, or when it gets to that last little cliff that's been cut out for the road, it goes fast, too fast to absorb into the ground. So both of those areas, above and below roads, are notorious for accumulating too much debris, and there's not enough water that is held in those areas to decompose them quickly. Add on top of that, whether they're blown or you drive by and push, whatever, unnatural accumulation of leaf litter is bad also, right? So that's like two different things that are happening that are sort of slowing down the decomp rates. But what's taking those trees down is probably wind pattern changes to begin with. You have a road, wind comes through, trees that used to be inside of a forest that never were exposed to full-on wind either break or die, or they're pruned, or a lot of times along 40 they'll do brush hogging on tree branches, and those trees are just going to die eventually, and then they'll break and die, fall down. So it's kind of a combination effect, and you'll see it more alongside roads than anywhere else. And also below and above like home sites, same idea, right? You open up a new area, that area is quickly disturbed by a new disturbance program, usually wind, and then add into that a change in water cycling or hydrology, and you've disrupted the decomposition rates naturally. So that's usually why we see so much stuff around roads and where we are. If you walk like deep into the woods, it's probably going to be more of like open forest ground. Maybe one tree on the ground over here, and some stuff like that. But I would challenge you to try that out, and you'll find that it's pretty accurate. So having debris on the ground is great for all the trees way below that, because as they decompose slower, they're providing kind of a slow release buffer for that water. Water, is either like not there, and something's happening where it's slowly releasing and building up more soil, and eventually that soil will act like a sponge for the rainwater at the top of the slope below the road. Or the other side, the mountain wants to rebuild that bank, right? It wants to, but it can't, because it's just too quick down. So when things are falling, it's kind of like a river damming up. Natural forest succession would lead you to believe that the trees are falling to collect enough debris, to build enough soil, to put more trees out in that area, and slowly rebuild that disturbance, because disturbances are just as natural as recovery to disturbances. So it's just a balance of nature. Yep.
So would landowners up here that had an inordinate amount of trees down, would they be well served to try to go ahead and remove some of that, or at least a percentage of it?
I would say to organize it, yes. Take things that are dangerous and make them not so dangerous, and then it's all site specific too. In an area that sees a lot of erosion, maybe you just need to move that debris a little bit further over here. If it's an area that's just accumulating debris for some reason way too much, yeah, get some of that out of there. The other caveat there though is, or the devil's advocate or whatever, the other side of that is you don't want to cause more disturbance to do that than exists to begin with. So it's kind of a fine line, but I would say very site specific, but a general rule of thumb would be manage down debris, so it doesn't create a hazard, both fire hazard and if you're walking through the woods, you don't want a bunch of trees hanging over your head that are half dead and barely hanging on to something, that kind of thing, as far as the community goes. And then the other thing of that is to manage the water that's traveling on these roads well. water bars, drainage ditches that go, not just one culvert, but multiple culverts that dump into, that cross the road underneath, Water bars are probably the most underrated improvement to communities like this that I've ever seen. Just because you can change the surface water, you can divert it so easily with 2-3 inches, and it's barely even a speed bump, but it will change the hydrology very quickly. That's a personal take on that. But I've noticed that places that put in water bars are better. Yep. Okay. Or kind of like more of a planned stormwater runoff systems, or cleaner culverts. Most of them get clogged with sediment and leaf debris, and you'll be lucky to be cleaned out. They'll overflow, go across the road will start falling apart, and then they'll come in and redo the road, and they'll just kind of not do the drainage part of it. And not everywhere. There's some that are really well maintained, but that's what I would see is water management first, then debris, and then, vegetation is the kind of priority that I see.
Just for the benefit of the folks here,
Yeah,
keeping those culverts clean is a big deal around here.
good,
That is talked about
awesome,
every month.
that's awesome,
Yeah.
awesome.
Talked about and worked at every month.
I'm sure, yeah, it's a lot, it's not, it's, whether you're looking at riprap or a poured asphalt ditch, anything, it's, where I live, the fire department in Black Mountain will come and blow your culverts out, free of charge. So that's pretty cool. You just call them up, hey, I gotta, I'm getting backed up here, they'll bring their hoses up, and it's great.
There you go, John. Fairfield.
But this is just one more quick, silly diagram that kind of does all the stuff we talked about. I'm not going to be more redundant. I wonder how we're doing on time with this small of a group. Wow, look at that, 4:29. Oh my gosh. So you can get these diagrams. Yep.
I have one other question.
Yep.
As far as hickory trees around here, are there a lot of different kinds of
Yeah.
hickory trees? Because I've got one, somebody pointed,
Shellbark, mockernut, shagbark.
they're all
Pig nut.
common? Okay, because I've got one that's like about an 80-footer in my backyard on the
What's
south
it look like?
side.
Oh, you describe it to me.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if I'm gonna.
What I would tell you is I need a petiole. I need the bottom part of a leaf to tell you.
So you can't tell by it.
I might be able to. Nope, can't tell. So what you can do though is grab a leaf that's fallen, right? So a hickory is a leaf, there's leaflets. I'm talking about the whole leaf is, the stem, the little at the bottom of the stem, petiole. So it's a stem and then multiple leaflets, right? That stem below, the petiole, if it is smooth, it's a pignut hickory. If it's furry and has like pubescent hairs on it, it's a mockernut hickory around here. You have to go further north and further high, like further up in elevation to get shellbark here, and shagbark is very rare here. It's probably a pignut or mockernut. Yep. Okay.
We have some that are about 15 years old, we think, they were already here when we bought the house. And they're thinning at the bottom, so what do you do for those to make them grow thicker at the bottom? Because then we can see through to our neighbor's house.
Okay, so leonds are tough because once they smell death, they love it. I don't know why, but once they start to, brown, like if you get a brown spot in one of them, if you get one, it's easy to deal with. My suggestion to you, if you want to reestablish lower growth on the lelands, there's two things you can do. Don't cut the tops. Don't prune any of the sides up top. But down low, in that first 4 feet, rake out all of the junk under there until it's almost bare soil, right? Almost. I don't know what you have under there, mulch
We've
or.
done that.
So rake all that out, go up in there, and cut out only the dead stuff on the inside. So you create really nice airflow in and up the tree. Okay, that's step one. Two, in the season, whenever they grow at your house, sometime in the spring, when the new growth comes out, look for that new growth on the end of those, those branches that look like this at the bottom. And you're just gonna take a pair of scissors, like sewing scissors, and just cut them back, like, we call it, candling, but you're gonna have to cut them back to wherever you think they'll grow down into that space, because they're probably not gonna sprout from the trunk ever again. So your goal is going to be to grow the lowest branches that are alive back down, right? So if you're looking at this one leaning branch that's like this, some of the twigs and branches on that branch are going to be pointed down. You want to promote the growth of those and reduce the growth of where you don't want it to go, right? Ones that are pointing up, cut down, and ones that are pointing down, leave them alone. And cut a little bit off the ends of them if you think they'll kind of push out.
We've been trying to.
Fraser magnolia.
Okay.
Magnolia fraseri. It's one of the few magnolias here. So we have tulip poplars and magnolias, Fraser magnolia. We have cucumber tree, which is Magnolia acuminata. Those are the magnolias that we'll find in the forests. There's also big leaf magnolia, which is a common name that's used for Fraser and acuminata.
Scott, when you get a permitted tree taken down, do you advise to leave the stump, have it ground, or does it really make any difference?
Site specific again.
Okay.
I lean on that, site specific. But I prefer to leave the root systems intact no matter what it is.
Okay.
But the options for above ground activity can range from grinding the stump down to a couple inches below the ground,
Mm-hmm.
to leaving the stump above ground, and you can sprinkle high nitrogen fertilizer on it if you want, and it will make sure it doesn't sprout back. But if it's already dead, the best thing to do is just leave it. If it's unsightly, go ahead and flush cut it to the ground and grind it down enough to where you can just cover it up with some leaf debris
Okay.
and let ferns grow or moss or something like that. Would be
Okay.
my suggestion.
Okay.
Depending on the species,
Sure.
you might not be able to get things to grow right on top of it. And you can have it ground down. Don't let the grinder chase the roots though.
Okay.
It's a lot harder to recover the ground area when they do that much.
Okay.
So if you want to replant something right where that tree was, you can have the middle ground down 8-10 inches, and then wait a year, put some mulch or something on it to help decomposition. Wait a year, and then plant something in there that has a good root ball.
Okay. Thank you.
Can you transplant trees easily, and what size? We've had this come up, and
Not easily.
no, and don't they have a high death rate?
Most construction workers will say, yes, we can do that. And it might have a different accent on it, but they'll say, yes, we can do that, and they will just grab it with a machine and put it over here. That is not my definition of transplanting. So my definition of transplanting is so the biggest tree that I would personally, from our business, that I would agree to transplant would probably be like a 3-inch tree. If it's a Japanese maple, I'll probably go up to 4 or 5 inches. If it's, a spruce, I would say 1 inch. They just don't like to be touched. White oaks, they don't like to be touched. Flame azaleas? You can't even look at a flame azalea. What were you thinking?
Somebody wanted to,
We had an incident with the ACC where somebody had probably a 70-foot tree that they talked about trying to move that tree.
It's doable.
We said,
It's doable, but the cost is unbelievable. So the biggest one that I was ever involved in was a 35-foot swamp white oak. It was 35 feet tall, but it was really big spread, right? So first we had to prune it, so it would fit on the semi-truck. So we pruned it within the oversized load sizes. That was like in the beginning of the year, pruned it, okay? And then you take, for this, we used a, like part of an air spade, like part of a tree spade, not the whole thing, but just one. They also make them for excavators. It's just like a giant blade, and you cut down, right? So you go around and you decide what you're going to dig out, and you cut, and you wait another 6 months. And after you do that, the roots that you cut will have hardened off and grown, back. And that's important for the transplanting process, is to pre-spade your tree. So if you're going to dig something up, even if it's small, go out and cut the area first, and then wait like 5 days minimum, if not a month, and then go dig it up afterwards. It'll help the transplant so much better, because it'll still be in its environment, but it will be like, oh, okay, like I just lost some roots, but everything's cool. I'll just grow some roots back. There won't be exposed live tissue that's all of a sudden in the air. We pre-spade everything we dig up. We try to pre-spade. So on a bigger scale, go all the way around, 20-foot diameter, pre-spade everything. Now you have this big hole, and then outside of the spade, you dig a trench, 6 feet deep, maybe at least. Once you get down 6 feet, you have a 6-foot trench around a 20-foot root area. Then you have to start digging sideways, which is all hand. So you're like, sideways digging, and then you prop it up, sideways digging, until you have like the entire root system propped up on logs or other pieces of wood. And then you can run straps under it, right? Big, huge crane straps. Then you crane, pick it up. Hopefully you didn't forget any roots, and the whole thing comes up. Then you wrap the whole thing in burlap or other whatever material you have at the time. Strap it all in, seat belt it, and pray. Because, once that goes it has to go on sideways, right, onto the truck. And it has to be under all the highways and it has to fit all the DOT laws and rules, which is very hard to do with a mature tree sideways. And then, once it gets to where it's going, everything in reverse. Dig a huge swimming pool size hole, get this thing up, set it down, backfill it in. It's a $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to begin with situation.
How much water does that take once you've replanted it?
So
How would you have to water that to keep it alive?
if you do it really well, it's not much more than the proportional amount that you would do for any other size tree. Because this 35-foot swamp white oak was only about this big, right? So, I would say a number, but it would be BS. It's just to keep the soil not oversaturated. Finger test. Put your finger in it. If it comes out dry, it needs water. If it comes out soaking wet, it doesn't need any water. If it comes out slightly damp, you're probably in perfect shape. If you do it all correctly, you've maintained the soil, wetness of what you dug up, and it wouldn't have drained or dried up too much. And it's all in like 1 or 2 days that you have to do it all in. So manageable, doable, yes. Would I ever approach it? Absolutely not.
Wow.
I've passed those years a long time ago. There was a time, probably 15 years ago, be like, oh yeah, let's try it. And then, who knows how much money and pain and stress.
Did that tree survive?
I have no idea. Yeah. I wish I'm for a long time I checked on it, it was fine. And then I moved away to Southern Ohio, and I haven't been back, and I should check on it. But,
What would they do with the hole that was left too? And that had to be dealt with.
Oh, you have to
got
fill it
erosion,
in,
all the other-
and
Stabilize
They
it.
use backfill, because it was back in the day, they used backfill.
Oh.
But also, the subsequent years, no grass grew on it,
Right,
ever.
yeah.
It was constantly soggy, it was wet, it was not fun, and it was not a, this happened and it was great situation. It was just like everybody was upset, and everybody was like, oh man, like,
Somebody really wanted that tree, huh?
I'm glad that I wasn't in charge. I was helping someone else. It was like the beginning of my career. I was like helping another arborist do it, and I was like, this is a lot. Because then you look at pictures of like the 30s and 40s, and they're like hauling these huge trees around, and you're like, that must have taken a week. Like a whole week to dig up, Anyway, I could go on. But,
When you were up in Ohio, did you ever get up to Hartwick Pines in Michigan?
no,
You ever heard of it?
no. What's it called?
Hartwick Pines.
Hartwick Pines.
It's kind of in the upper middle of the lower peninsula. It's
Okay.
virgin
I'm
pine
supposed to-
forest.
I'm supposed to visit my buddy he's an ER doctor in Traverse City. And
Oh,
if
Check
I
out
go there, I'll bring
Hartwick
it up.
Pines
Okay.
if you're driving up. It's not too far from Traverse City.
Okay, sweet.
If you really want to make an adventure, go to South Manitou Island and see the
Okay.
quote land of the giant cedars.
Okay, I will. He's told me some stuff about the UP and the new bike trails and things going in there.
Well, this is Lower Peninsula.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's not even across.
No.
Oh, sick. So that's easier.
If you're going to Traverse City, you want to get over and see probably
Okay,
Sleeping
Jack.
Bear, sand dunes, and then you're looking at South Manitou Island, which is where the cedars are. I don't think the ferry will still be running.
Okay, yeah. No, I'm into any suggestions, and that's one part of the Lower Continental that I somehow bypassed. I did a little Finger Lake stuff on my way up to Canada once, but never really got over there.
Scott, I understand, I'm sorry. I didn't
Yeah,
mean
go
to-
ahead.
I was gonna say, I understand you do consulting,
Mm-hmm.
we contact you and you'll come out. What does that cover, or what do you do if you come out? If we ask you to come out and look at our yard, our trees, what would you be looking for, what would you,
Coffee
I know
or
it's
beer?
site specific, but I'm just
Coffee
saying.
A nice bourbon would be great.
Okay, all right.
I like double oak Woodford.
Lunch.
personally. You know, so, or Peerless is a new one I got.
Weller's.
Yeah.
I like Weller's a lot, yeah. You know, just send me an email, or, you know, if you go on our website, there's a free Ask an Arborist, and just send back, you know, free information. What's this tree? What do I do here? I hit these roots, whatever, that's all free.
Okay.
Consulting wise, you know, for this group and anybody that comes to these presentations, it's not a charging thing. If you want a report, that's different, and we can talk about what you want,
Sure.
you know,
Okay.
and then you get like a certified report with pictures and things like that.
Oh, okay,
But if you just want to do a yard walk, and it's
Mhm.
15, 30 minutes, no big deal.
okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, thank you. I'm glad, I like little, you know, smaller groups. It's easier to kind of, you know, people aren't as afraid to speak out. You know,
I
ask
don't think
questions.
anybody in this group's afraid to speak out.
No, yeah,
I
that's
don't
good.
know.
Put that line up and tell me what that tree is.
The silver maple out here?
Is it a
Big,
silver
big
maple?
gigantic two
The two that are,
out front.
Yeah,
Yeah.
push the button.
Well, go to this window then.
straight out.
Silver
There's
maple.
two of them.
Silver maple, Acer Saccharum.
Mhm.
Planted in the 60s. Now you're not allowed.
Are they not
Not allowed. The structure, you know, this one's been pruned, you know, but the structure and the form of them outgrows what they can handle. So they were planted, you know, like all over the place in the 60s, because they're fast growing, beautiful foliage, lots of cover. But then they noticed, you know, it's kind of like a much better, more appropriate version of a Bradford pear. Like it's a great street tree for the first 30, 40 years, but then it's like causes some issues if it wasn't carefully, you know, if you don't do a return on investment management plan, it can get out of hand, it can go too wide too quick, and then the structure's missing, so it kind of, you know, it just kind of grows too much this way and not enough up this way, so it doesn't have a central leader. This one has a decent central leader, so if you look up, I'm not going to be tall enough to open this further, but if you look up the center of this one, it has a really nice central leader. It has, you know, two reaching limbs. Like if I had to talk myself into doing something to this tree, it would be a very light pruning for the sprouts that are out here over the lamp posts on the cuts that were made. Just very light pruning, and then eventually, maybe in 5 to 7 years, I'd do a simple single cable system from both of the bigger spreading ones up to that central leader. Just because people park here, mainly, you know.
Well, every year they're putting out less and less foliage.
I'm sure,
Yeah.
because their root systems
And
grow
they're
crazy.
losing
And they're,
some fairly big branches too.
yeah. Best thing to do with these is do like a root collar extraction, re-aerate the entire area around the root collar, find all the girdling roots that are choking it out, snip them off, and then do a retrenchment pruning, which is just kind of making the canopy a little smaller.
Do we have the room to do that out there on that one?
That would be like an ideal scenario, would be like anywhere, like, you know, I've seen much smaller landing zones. You know, and what ends up happening is leaf litter, mulch, things that accumulate around the trunk. This is why I mentioned earlier, you want to keep things away from the trunk. Roots will always grow in the path of least resistance. So, excuse me. Silver maple roots are pretty fast growing, and they end up sprouting off of any, if you run over with a lawnmower or, you know, a car or a hit or weed or whatever, they'll sprout a root. And that root will just circulate, you know, and circle the tree right under the ground, and you'll never know it until it starts cutting off buttresses, and then you'll see big decay happening, and you'll be like, man, I wonder what's going on there. And you just uncover 4 inches, and all of a sudden there's a root that's girdling the entire side of the tree, you know, and you're like, oh gosh, that hurts. We do like one of those weird satisfaction Instagram video things, and there's a whole series on pulling girdling roots off of other roots, and it's weird. It's like you pull it off, and it's like just the perfect root shape is embedded in the buttress root.
Huh.
Trees love it though; they respond pretty quickly.
Great
Thank
job.
you.
Great job.
Thank
Thank you, Scott, appreciate it.
This is awesome.